And Sean Penn joins me now. Sean, great to see you. It's been quite a while, 10 years, I think, since I last interviewed you.
Yeah, about that.
We're in a world of self-identity. Are you here identifying as an actor, a humanitarian, an activist, or something else?
Good question. I suppose I'm here identifying as somebody who'd like to get eyes and ears on this film, Superpower, and a continued conversation on our obligations to Ukraine.
The film, I've watched it twice. I think it's a great film.
Thank you.
And it couldn't be more timely because due to events in the Middle East with the Israel-Hamas war, a lot of global attention has moved away from Ukraine. And President Zelensky, who I know you know well, and I went to Kyiv and interviewed him myself, is very concerned that while the world looks away, Vladimir Putin will accelerate his attempt to effectively take as much of Ukraine as he can get. How perilous do you think this moment is for Ukraine?
I think the way I equate it is how perilous is it for mankind in our general mission focus, be that with our families or with the world at large. There are not too many distractions available to get us off course if we don't let there be. The concerns in the Middle East are, of course, very real and great. But with the principles intact that those in the world who believe in freedom, whether you call it democracy or something else, we're not given more to do than we're able to do. And I think it's just the micro stuff and the breaking down of each other in all of this is really the distraction that we should worry about. Obviously, that's manipulated by enemies. I never felt that, for example, President Putin's trip to Tehran was strictly about drones. And I do believe that there was an influence on what happened October 7th in Gaza, in Israel, that too was influenced by this. So these things have connections, and so to defeat those things or for freedom to triumph is to be able to maintain focus on both and the other issues of the day.
There's a fascinating moment in the movie, and I'm going to come to the movie in a lot more depth a little later, but there's a fascinating moment about freedom where Zelensky reveals he came to America, I think, in the late 80s as an impressionable young man to see what freedom and democracy actually looked like. And it was that inspired him to want freedom of this kind for his own country.
Yes, yes. Yeah, that really hit home with me because it was almost the inversion of that I was experiencing, having talked myself into believing that I had been living in a free country. But what does free mean? And free really has to include a sense of unity, a community, and yes, diverse opinions, but dealt with in civil and productive ways for tomorrow and for the more long term. And when I got to Ukraine and I felt that so embedded in its current culture, I realized what I'd been missing, and I said that in the film. It really was at once incredibly tragic. Of course, the reasons what's forced them into this kind of high moment of incredible unity is devastating. And yet it's another opportunity for humankind to look at itself and say, what is it we really need so that we have a quality of life that we can share with each other.
Do you see parallels between what's happening in Israel and Gaza and the Ukraine-Russia war?
Well, of course, there are certain parallels. The wanton disregard for, and in fact, proactive attack on civilians, on children, on infrastructure. And the biggest parallel, I suppose, the one I think we could spend our time most productively focusing on is the way in which, and this extends to so much else, the way in which nuance is not allowed into the conversation. Now, what's not a parallel in the case of, what's not nuanced at all in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, or rather Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine, is that's a very unambiguous set of circumstances. It's a very clear black hat involved here, a black hat against all our human principles with Russia's horrible and misguided invasion. and all the murder and all of the taking of children and re-educating of children to hate their parents and their country and things we just shouldn't stand for as any single section of it. My sense is that, and I'm not an expert on the Middle East, but my sense is certainly that they're, with the horror of what Hamas has done, that to get to a productive result for Jews, for Israelis, for Arabs in Israel, for Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank, and around the Middle East, we might not like it, but it's going to take a very nuanced conversation, and the sooner we get to it, the better. And the more push there is, or resistance to that conversation, it will, the legacy will be that those who pushed against the nuanced conversation would have been the ones to have extended the problem. You
recently told Variety magazine, before what's just blown up in the Middle East, if you'd been US president after 9/11, you'd have done things differently. You said, if I have to go to prison, I'll go, but I'm going to kill them. I'm killing everyone that did this, but only them. And we know where the F's they are, where the F they are. In the context of that gut response that you had to 9/11, do you understand why Israel has reacted the way it's done, even if you don't endorse it? But do you understand their desire, their fervent need as a country to go after Hamas and eliminate the people that perpetrated the terror attack? Were Hamas living in remote mountains of Tora Bora, I would have absolutely understood it. But when you have a place like, topographically similar, let's say it's Malibu, California in size and scope, and though 100 times more populated, when we think of Gaza, we do have to understand, without taking a side, being a defender, apologist for anything, those children are hearing every gunshot throughout the country, are feeling every ordnance that drops. This is 24/7. This is a tiny place packed with people. That's very different. I would say absolutely I would like to see Hamas evaporated in mountains like Tora Bora, as perhaps could have al-Qaeda at that time. See, that's my moral quandary with what's happening right now with Israel and Hamas, because I completely believe that they have a fundamental right and duty to their citizens to stop Hamas doing what they did again. And Hamas have said publicly, we're going to try and do it again and again and again. But the particularly unique makeup of Gaza, with half the population being children, means that if you do a constant bombardment for many weeks, as the way the Israelis have done, you're going to kill thousands and thousands of completely innocent children. And I find that morally repugnant that that's happening. And yet I defend their moral right to go after Hamas. It's a difficult situation, isn't it? It's very difficult. Of course, one has to be very aware. That could have been my daughter or son at that music festival, for example. I mean, I understand the immediate reaction to that, even the long-term reaction to it. But again, we do have to also say, well, it's somebody else's children next time. And when I said that I felt that, that I had had a dream that President Bush might just say, I'm sending the White House counsel home. This has to be done. We'll suffer the consequences later in Tora Bora with al-Qaeda. I also said that having done that, he might have licensed himself to then go back in time and say, in what ways? Again, we know these are the kind of things that people love to chew apart. In what ways were we complicit in the poverty, in the hopelessness, in the oppression of a people somewhere else, in the lack of inclusivity of those people that contributed to that hatred that came our way? So in this case too, there are the big differences. One is the civilian population of Gaza, and the other is that we are told not to speak about the accountability of Israel and the United States in their support of Israel, in many ways unconditional support. And I'm 48% Ashkenazi Jew. Right. I have nothing but love for my ancestry and ancestors. That doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I think that while
Israel's people were criminally, horrifyingly attacked, that Israel also has a prime minister who is a terror by any measure of basic political thinking. That's bad timing.
You think he's an actual terrorist, Netanyahu?
Well, I didn't say terrorist. I wouldn't necessarily jump to say that, because I don't know that he's trying to create terror so much as he's trying to create an inflated sense of his own worth in his time.
Your father, the actor and director Leo Penn, as you said, an American Jew of Eastern European descent, also a highly decorated war veteran. He served as a tail gunner and bombardier in the B-24 Liberator with the US Air Force in World War II, actually stationed here in England.
That's right.
And of course was fighting the Nazis, which were an existential threat to civilization at the time. You know, many Israelis say what they're going through now is the worst existential threat to what happened to them in the Holocaust. Your dad was an amazing guy. Life expectancy for the role that he played in that war was 7 missions. He did 37.
He did.
Is that where you get this warrior spirit from?
I would only aspire to it. I've never been tested like that. Yeah, but he is the hero in my experience. Yeah.
What would he, do you think, have made of what's happening now with Israel? And what advice would he give them, do you think, to try and get to a better place?
My dad used to have an expression when I would come home very opinionated on one issue or another and very angry at anyone who believed differently. He would say, you know, everyone has their own truth, kid. And I think his advice would be for people to recognize what is true of each other's position. And then it's also important to recognize what is a lie that group thinkers tell themselves to be comfortable and to have a group and an identity. And I think this extends again to the broader cultural picture of a lot of what's distracting from us getting down to the things that will help our world be better.
Well, it's become so toxic and tribal, the debate, driven, I think, by social media. People belong to tribes on social media. Facts don't matter. It's just all about being completely one way, completely another, and then shrieking at each other. There's never any consensus. People never admit they're wrong. They never move with facts. Right. It's just about being tribal. I've really noticed that in the last 15 years since Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and so on.
Yeah, and if we don't attack it culturally, we all know that the technology is now increasingly there, exponentially growing every day, for idiots to operate as successfully as brilliant minds, to create sort of impenetrably real-seeming reflections of a world that are falsehoods. AI, for example. I saw a demonstration done of someone who, a friend of mine, involved in AI, and he doesn't speak any Japanese, but he was able to look straight in the camera and speak whatever it was. And then the AI takes not only his voice as it would speak proper Japanese, but also alters the movement of the mouth to house that, and it's seamless. So we've got a lot of surprises coming. It's
someone did that to me for a TED talk with me promoting use of guns when I was campaigning against the NRA. It was frightening. It was so realistic. I almost believed it was me. Yeah. And that was several years ago. So God knows what they're capable of now.
Yeah, and if anyone thinks that the United States is not in the crosshairs of Russia, well, just keep watching some of what happens in that way.
Yeah. You've been very scathing of America's lack of what you think is proper support, particularly with Ukraine, with regard to their ability to control the air. You would like to have seen America supply F-16 fighters and so on. Why do you feel so strongly about that?
First, I think, and most of the military strategists that I've had an opportunity to talk to, and that's a cross-section of some of what are credibly described as the best minds in that space, feel that this war would have been over by now had that happened. Not only would it have been over, but from the personalized point of view, friends of mine would not be dead who are dead now, who were fighters in Ukraine. And I think that, that there is a point where caution becomes cowardice. It doesn't have to be personal cowardice. It could be the way that we re-identify our country's tenor. And it's very disappointing, heartbreaking to me that we've been given this opportunity and so far let it down more than we have supported it. There's a lot of talk of how we've supported it. Even the president and the government of Ukraine, are constantly grateful for the support of the United States. But I think we all know that it has been substandard wouldn't be a fair word when so many are dying. And just as importantly, substandard wouldn't be a good enough word when so much of the American aspiration is systematically dying with it. We need to step up. Every day is another opportunity. The Ukrainians are certainly ready to fight the fight. They've never asked for our troops to be on the ground or in the air. And there's been a lot of sort of smoke and mirror talk about how long it would take, whether there were the maintenance crews available. There's actually been workarounds available on that from the very beginning. And within the first months of the war, there could have been F-16s without American pilots.
The reason,
flying
of course, that I think was behind them being hesitant was they didn't want to trigger a wider conflict with a nuclear power. And you said this about that. I use the word cowardice because I don't know any other word to describe what happens when we argue caution as restraint. Restraint looks like John F. Kennedy holding back military action during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's a powerful piece of leadership. Caution looks like I'm scared the bad guys are going to do something if I do what's right, so let's do nothing. Or let's do just enough that won't get me more scared. I thought that was so spot on because all Putin's had to do in this war is rattle his nuclear capability cage. And everyone's like, oh my God, we can't risk World War III.
Right.
When in fact, logically, why would he do that? Is my point about that. America has almost as many nuclear weapons as he does. If he did press that button, everyone dies.
Well, reasonably, it's unlikely that he'd do it, that we have to take it seriously, that possibility. But the trade-off seems simple. Doesn't mean we're ready to let him take over, because this, without the proper resistance, without the proper support of Ukraine, this doesn't stop. It'll be the Baltics first. It'll go on, Poland. It'll go on and on and on if he sees that all he's got to do is bark with that weapon.
Yeah, that's what I think. Also, there's a betrayal of the Ukrainians with nuclear weapons. We made them give theirs up.
That's
if they had those nuclear weapons, I don't think Putin would have countenanced invading.
Right.
But he knew he could invade a non-nuclear power with impunity. But if they'd been able to keep their weapons, they wouldn't have been a non-nuclear power.
And Americans should know, particularly, we did sign the Budapest Memorandum, and that did assure Ukraine that if they gave up those weapons, Russia, the United States, and the others involved would never even threaten intervention or violence against the country.
I've got a clip. This is from a 2001 Moscow Film Festival. You and Jack Nicholson actually meeting Vladimir Putin. A deviant memory. What is your memory of that meeting?
I remember this was approximately 2 weeks after the famous meeting between President Bush and Putin, where President Bush said something like, I looked him in the eye and I knew I could trust him. I didn't come away with a great, I don't mean a good or bad impression, a deep impression at the time. He was, a bit of a poker-faced fellow, talked about his kids. There were no politics discussed per se, but when I talk about it as a deviant memory, I look at that. And now, world head of state aside, world politics aside, I'm looking at somebody who's, cutting off babies' heads. I don't like having been next to that.
He has banned you from Russia. He's banned me. I've also had that badge of honor, as I see it.
There goes that summering in St. Petersburg trip we were planning.
But exactly. I got banned literally a few days after I came back from Kyiv, just for interviewing President Zelensky. And that we were deemed enemies of the state in Russia. Putin, to me, demonstrably, he's a war criminal. Should he be held to proper account for the war crimes he's been committing?
Well, of course he should, but I think right now, how that all winds down, when he is reduced, as I believe will happen, to a negotiation for himself. I'm less concerned about that than seeing Russia relent, recognize the territory, the complete territory of Ukraine, recognize its obligation towards reconstruction. I think in the United States, I think there are $30 billion of frozen Russian assets. Were that released to Ukraine, I think others, allies would follow, and I think the total bag is about $300 billion. So there's already money in hand to support Ukraine that way. What happens with him is, at this moment, still for me, a decision for the Ukrainians primarily.
I don't know if you've got it on you now, but for a long time you carried a card in your wallet by the great Armenian-American author William Sarain. And there was a quote from this, I think, part of a lengthier quote, but there's a bit that says, "Despise evil and ungodliness, but not men of ungodliness or evil. These understand. Have no shame in being kindly and gentle, but if the time comes in the time of your life to kill, kill and have no regret." It's a powerful quote.
It is, yeah. I don't think I knew what it meant really until, like I said, as you said, I carried that around forever. It made some visceral impact on me, and I could recognize the rhythm of the thoughts in a way that was provocative, more provocative, say, than anything I'd read in a short form like that. And so I kept it with me, thinking I knew what it meant, but sort of like the way an onion gets peeled. It wasn't until I got to Ukraine where I really felt like, okay, now I understand this thing.
Does any part of you understand, as he wrote there, about Putin, clearly a man of evil, many would say, I certainly would. But if you're playing devil's advocate, trying to get into his brain, do you understand why this guy thought the breakup of the Soviet Union was the worst thing that's ever happened to his country, felt like the NATO encroachment, as he saw it closer and closer to the Russian border, was a threat to the Russian people? I mean, does any part of that make any sense to you, or do you think it's just an excuse for his land grab?
I think we all know people, even from our own communities, sometimes within our own families, who, for whatever reasons, their principal nature in their life has had is absent some imagination, or has had that imagination somehow paralyzed. It's what I call kind of the bulb, no bulb people. You see the light of humanity in some people. So whatever the sort of speculation is, and I've read some of the histories of Putin and seen some of the documentaries, and I've certainly listened to better brains than mine talk about that and sort of analyze him. I think essentially what this is an unimaginative person, someone whose bulb either never got fully put on and therefore was not distracted by the colors of life that the rest of us embrace. And so there's a certain kind of savantism that is vulnerable to becoming simplistic in the kind of great ideas or great senses of pride that can be housed by a country or by its leader. So we're really dealing with something uninteresting and childish. And we see that can be a very dangerous thing.
Donald Trump says he would resolve this war in 24 hours.
I think in the United States, Donald Trump is guilty most of being a adolescent influencer of cheap thought. And cheap thought is very expensive. Again, I go back to what America should be searching for in a Democrat or a Republican. It's an aspirational figure, not someone you hang your lowest denominator on.
You've called him, Trump, an enemy of mankind in compassion.
Well, I think that, again, maybe it's overestimating him to say that, but certainly the effect of him or what he symbolizes of the disease we've allowed to be normalized up into and including him. So it's time, and this is why I think it's so important for all of us to be talking to each other again, you know, no matter whether we're on different sides of things or not, because we don't have to give it up to leadership on the level that we have. We can really start to reshape this and take lead from very small ways and forward and trying, you know, it's hard. I've been on the inflammatory circuit quite a bit myself, but I really, you know, working hard with some Republican friends to try to, you know, in our little way, even reframe that debate. And
you went on Sean Hannity's show on Fox News, which I thought was a really interesting moment. When you did that, that's a big deal for you to do that. You're going into what I guess would have been historically a kind of media enemy's lair.
Yeah.
But you were prepared to do that, to have that debate, and it was a very interesting interview, actually.
You know, I'm sure it's been thrown at you. A lot of, I probably used more by the left than the right. The left, with whom I'm more generally identified, and I would identify myself. But I think this term bomb thrower, you know, I've heard him referred to by the left as a bomb thrower. We're in a world now where we really got to pay attention to what a real bomb thrower looks like. And that's a bomb. And that's bodies on the pavement, some of them are children. And that's the destruction of infrastructure, and that's coal through the winter. That's, you know, while there's incredible influence by media figures, by political figures, if somebody has had no experience with real bomb throwers, perhaps they should hold that phrase and come up with something more particular to what their concern is, because it just makes it, again, it's you know, exaggerated and or just a perversion of what's really going on. I don't know about you, but most people I talk to, once you get it off the standard conversation of policy or personality, around the world, they want the same thing. They want a better world for themselves and their family tomorrow. They want education for their kids. It's the most common denominator.
And they can be quite reasonable. However unreasonable they may have sounded, and when you get past that, you can have what used to be perfectly normal conversation in a free democratic society.
Right.
But now we're in a world where cancel culture is a very real thing.
Right.
And you know better than anyone the dangers of this. What happened to your father, who was ostracized by Hollywood when he wouldn't throw his friends under the bus, when there was that huge, what was it, the big investigation into whether they were communists or whatever it may be. He refused to take part in that, and he never really got his career back as a result. That was cancel culture. And of course, you played Harvey Milk, again, a perfect illustration of what a world can do when it wants to cancel people. Now it's so much more prevalent now.
Yeah.
It's like people get cancelled for having an opinion, for just saying what they honestly believe about stuff.
Yeah.
How have we got there?
I say I would, I'm a little bit borrowing from Stephen Fry here. He gives this great closing argument at the end of a Monk debate on political correctness. And I think maybe, and it will seem ironic that I respond this way, maybe we've taken ourselves too seriously. And
have you included?
Perhaps at the forefront many times.
But I think it's because you do genuinely care passionately. I've always felt that about you, whether it's been over Haiti, whether it's when you went to Iraq, you went to Iran, you went to Syria to see Assad, even when you went to try and get to El Chapo. I've always felt that what's driving you is that you believe dialogue should be held and should be constructive.
Yeah, I think taking our world seriously, we can do a lot more effectively if we take ourselves more lightly in it. Especially when we sort of adhere to self-righteousness. And yes, again, I understand how I've been a part of that many times. You try, each day you try to put your foot forward. And I right now, my focus, I suppose, is what's going to happen in my country, and both for itself and for its impact on the world. You
said that you fly a big American and Ukrainian flag at your home in Malibu. You said, I'm a big proponent of the idea we start waving flags again, even if we're on the left, and we don't worry that our neighbours are going to think we suddenly became a MAGA hawk, which is what some of my friends accuse me of. just for having an American flag flying.
Yeah, but again,
That apparently is now offensive.
The left. A lot of friends of mine, we got to take the flag back, or we got to share it again.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that countries find true unity often in the worst possible circumstance. I felt that when I went to New York after 9/11, it felt like the whole country was united in that moment in a way I hadn't seen America probably in my lifetime. Similarly, I think, you had the same experience with Haiti and how the Haitians came together. I certainly felt it, I think you did in Ukraine, that the Ukrainian people were just almost completely as one in their desire to save their country, preserve their freedom, back their president. That wasn't the case before the war started.
No, but all the more, as important as our support of them to dominate this, to return their freedom and sovereignty to themselves and to rebuild their country, is the long-term plan. This is the opportunity for mankind, for all free-thinking people.
But why can't we unify?
That we remember that once that's resolved, we have to have the spirit and resources in place for it to be the example of it continuing beyond them unified under war.
That was the question I was going to ask you.
The leading example.
Why do we find it so hard to continue the unity when we get back to a more peaceful time?
I think unities are cannibalized first by those who are promoting unity. I think things blow up from the inside of an idea, and I think even in the case of Russia after 1994, I remember the relief. The Cold War is over, people are dancing. I don't think we ever looked back and noticed that the Russians were not feeling the relief that the world was feeling, and that gangsterism had replaced communism, and the bread lines were just as long, and things didn't get better for them. And you let that happen over time, and somebody like Putin is able to come back, take power, and do what he's doing.
We need strong leadership, never more so than from America. Joe Biden is seen as somebody who is just too old, frankly, for the challenges of the world right now. Do you agree with that?
What I'd say is this: is that whether he's too old or not, we do recognize that the optic is largely going that way. That the binary choice that's talked about is Donald Trump or until somebody steps forward to say they would enter this race, I don't care what party, but somebody who would be a stronger president than Joe Biden, then there's not much use in my talking about it. Except to say that, we don't know what he's capable of. Certainly, our general impression seems to be that, look, I think about myself at 63. It's harder to do the legwork than it used to be. So,
and he's 81, I think.
And Trump's no spring chicken, and what he's shooting in himself to have energy, I don't know, and what effect that has on his mind. But he started off at a deficit. It was only going to hurt the country and the world.
Does it worry you, the thought that Trump may win again? Because nothing they're throwing at him seems to make any difference. In fact, it all seems to increase his popularity, all these indictments and so on.
I know there's a lot of speculation that he may, and a lot of speculation that he may not. I think that my concern would, if I could, I'd like an x-ray of who we are in America today. Is that really possible? Because before Trump, that would be the problem. If we're still ready to let everything we stand for and everything my father's generation and those before stood for, and I don't mean that they accomplished all their tasks for everybody. We know that never happened, and that we hope it still can. But if we go soft and yellow and decide we're going to let it go and let this guy, as Judge Souter once said, take the ball and roll with it, then, I'm going to have to find my pride in a glass of vodka.
Might take more than one glass of vodka, Sean. Let's talk about Superpower. It's fascinating to me that this movie, as a much lighter film that you wanted to make about this extraordinary story of a guy who was an actor, a comedic actor predominantly. He'd been seen playing the piano with his penis on a special on TV for the delectation of Ukrainian people, and they all laughed. Then he takes part in this series called Servant of the People, where, as a comedic actor, he ends up becoming president of Ukraine.
Right.
And we got a clip. Such a powerful clip, that, because it's so prescient. Yeah. Because this guy then becomes the real president of Ukraine, and very quickly has a very bad guy and other bad guys coming to take his country. Yeah. In that moment, your whole film that you've been making, which is a light, fun look at a guy who's a comedy actor, and you're an actor, and you think, this is fun. Mm-hmm. And then it gets incredibly serious. And fascinatingly, right to the point of war, you've detected from your filmmaking there, he's not that popular, right? People think he's in bed with corrupt oligarchs. His big popularity when he got elected is all dissipated. Most people, in fact, everyone I think you speak to, either says I wouldn't vote for him or I wouldn't vote for him again, even the ones who voted. So this is not a popular guy. Right. And yet in that moment of the ultimate challenge, he becomes a completely different character. For you as a filmmaker, for you as an actor, what did you make of all this?
Well, personally, it's one more time where I could say, I try to be light and then pull me back in. We really did.
It's like Al Pacino in Godfather 3. It sucked me back in.
Yeah. It's interesting. I take it back a little bit to when we were talking about President Biden. This is somebody who has been an extraordinary person of service for so long, understands the game very deeply, the process, the bureaucratic process, and I think has a lot to offer. I wish that we had a reverence for the sort of elder statesman position that could serve in this way and not have to go state to state to state to shake hands and smile with babies to be elected president. And so I, as one American citizen, I would like to see the possibility of, a kind of heightened position for somebody like if President Biden decides not to run at some point. I know there's no suggestion of that, but I think there could be a great value in something like that. This situation was so, we met President Zelensky the first time. I had said, because of what I thought could be a value-added documentary that I could make versus some accomplished documentarian or journalist, that it's always been a kind of a trust and trustworthiness bond, and maybe it would be a different kind of conversation. And therefore I didn't want to have a camera available the first time we met face to face. And it was just a crazy coincidence of timing that we met the first time on the 23rd without a camera.
Literally the day before the war starts.
Right, and agreed that on the 24th, we'd do our first session with the camera.
And unbelievably, he sees you.
He fulfilled the commitment despite the rockets coming in.
We've got a clip of this. I mean, it's incredible. The war starts and he takes time to see you, and no offense, Sean Penn, you're an actor. Yeah. Were you surprised he kept that meeting? And why do you think he did?
I was surprised. Of course I was surprised. We were all processing the tragedy of this unimaginable decision of Putin's. Today I understand it better. I think he's very savvy. I think that any opportunity to have a record of, I think he believed in what he was going to do and what his people were going to do. So much so that in a country at war, we were never watched over when we were shooting. We never had a minder. There was never a word of influencing anything.
Really?
And when you talk to him, as you did, I sense, more so than many people in leadership around the world that I've met, many of whom I like and admire a lot, there generally is some level of selling the agenda. He's so consistently genuine and extemporaneous. And I think when, I guess it goes to when you have nothing to hide and when you have a clear vision of something, you can let somebody see right into it and not be so guarded. And so here, I think he probably anticipated the potential value of anyone who might get a platform for Ukraine.
Especially in America.
As this, yeah.
He knew how important America would be, and he thought using a Hollywood superstar, multiple Oscar winner, would shine a light right when he needed it to get help from America. That's a guy who understands the media, understands politics, possibly from playing a president in a comedy. I mean, it's surreal the way you guys came together like this.
Yeah, and another way to look at it is, whenever I've been very focused and had a lot of responsibility. I'm not comparing it to the responsibility he has, but I've had responsibilities in certain situations to a lot of people and sometimes to their physical well-being. And, you do find that moment where your bandwidth needs to step outside and have a cigarette. It may be that, he used this opportunity. I would say he stepped outside and essentially had a cigarette.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that it's like he took time out of fighting a war.
He was also, Sean, at the time, on that day, the #1 target in the country for Putin. You were warned by your team, look, we need to get out of here because they're probably going to do a strike right here. It was highly likely. I mean, that was more likely than not. And yet you stayed to see him. Did you not think that was a particularly dangerous moment in your life?
I've had times where I've had anxiety about certain situations I've been in conflict zones and so on, but statistically never like long-term journalists who are there forever, or the people who live there, or the soldiers that fight the fight. So statistically, I was safe. And then, it just was so overwhelmingly heartbreaking because I knew this was going to affect my kids, the whole world, in a way that I'd not seen before or known before. And I think the worst of that may be yet to come if the allies, NATO, get behind this country in a real aggressive way. But I just didn't feel it. I think Sadat one time said, I'm going to die, but not 1 second before God says so. Didn't feel like this was going to change that.
It was a moment when you go to the front line. This is about 4 months later. And a woman says this to you. I mean, that's a moment when you hear that, because that's completely true. The front line doesn't care who you are or how many Oscars you've won. You end up 150 meters away from Russians across a river. Notwithstanding, you've been in a few hairy situations in your life. That must have been a seriously unnerving moment, wasn't it?
I think you make a decision when you get on an airplane, where even if big turbulence comes, if you're not a pilot, you can get as anxious as you want. It doesn't really matter what you're going to do about it if something's going to happen. Of course, I took a deep breath at some point before we went in, but I also felt that, and what's here, I think quite graciously, that voice who was working as a translator with us, she offered an abundance of caution. But again, it's almost an embarrassing thing I understand the question, and there's some versions of this I could say differently. But when I think of people who are staying there in that fight, versus parachuting in for a second and getting a little bit of a story and going out, I don't really know how to talk about that. But this was mostly felt obligatory to the story we were telling to go there and to at least touch base with that. And
there's a moment when you go to an apartment block. This is in your first visit after the war started in June, and you see the devastation for yourself. I'd gone to a month after you when I did a show or 2 shows from Kyiv and walked in, I'm pretty sure, the same apartment block. And I don't know how you felt but I felt I'd never been in that kind of, I'm not a war correspondent. I don't normally go to places like this. And just to see the utter devastation of just, in that case, one person's life.
Yeah.
Now everything destroyed, all their little possessions gone, tiny fragments of dolls and so on. Just, I guess, a moment of realization of the reality of what warfare actually involves. Yeah. It's not just frontline soldier to soldier. No. It is the constant barrage of civilian life and ordinary people's lives.
It's all the families that have been separated for 2 years while the men stay to fight the fight or support the fight in country, and the mothers and the children who are spread out all over the world, some with no promise of anywhere, anything to go, or any support, and in some cases getting otherworldly support. Poland in particular was, both the civilians and the leadership were extraordinary toward them. But still, that's walking out into a brave new world and just worrying every day about your brother or your father, or your son who's in the fight.
You dedicate the film to a Ukrainian fighter pilot called Andrei Pilshchikov, known as Juice. He was the leader of the failed, including, I think, 13,000 civilians. Tell me about him for a moment. I mean, the impact he had on your life.
Well, I like to say we became friends. We kept in touch after we spent time in Washington. I might, we'd be on an encrypted line that he was okay with, and I might, say, hey, what's happening? He said, just about to go wheels up, and he'd be, because they were constantly in the fight. He was a very poetic creature, not what you would expect of a Top Gun, essentially Top Gun fighter pilot. He was a great leader. And I know many in his squadron, and he really was, as much as any individual that they were speaking of when they came up with the one-off of the Ghost of Kiev. His mother, Lilia, is a force, and I think will ultimately be considered, the mother of the Ukrainian Air Force. She's there supporting and supported by all the guys in his squadron as they now begin the program with F-16s, which is going to take some time, but is now finally ongoing. Not supported well enough, but beginning at least. He's a guy who believed he owed his country service. He was sort of personality-wise the furthest thing you'd think from a military man, and a beautiful spirit and great humor. Most people know that movie, Top Gun Maverick, and when we were watching it in D.C., I was sitting next to him, and he leaned over at one point after Tom Cruise had ejected, and found his way in his dusty flight suit to the diner, and he leaned over and he said, "That's why I always take my wallet."
How did you find out that he died?
So, somebody I don't know. I mean, if he would mind my saying his name, you can assume who it is from. Let's say the civilian now, someone who had worked in government, who would have known anything the New York Times knew by the time the New York Times knew it. Anything where you collect open source material. And a very credible person called me in the middle of the night and said, no, because I'd introduced the two of them in D.C. and knew that I would want to know, and said this happened. And then I double-checked it with the Ministry of Defense in Ukraine, and they came back and said, yeah.
Sad moment for you.
Yeah.
Well,
but sort of like what you're talking about with the apartment, right? It's personalized.
Yeah.
And it's personalized tens of thousands of times.
You were angry when the Academy, just after the war blew up, decided not to let Zelensky speak at the Oscars. And then, of course, that Oscars became known for the Will Smith, Chris Rock punch up on stage, which you don't think would have happened if Zelensky had been allowed to speak, because the idea of someone then committing an act of violence publicly at the same event would have been unthinkable.
Right. Yeah, I mean, look, there was, what are films? It's not just the celluloid you print them on. It's bigger medicine than that. It can be. And so they're ideas, they're stories. What more cinematic idea or story is there, or more identified with film a film star, also a filmmaker, Zelensky. What's more appropriate at that moment in time to address the Academy Awards? He had no intention of being partisan politics in the United States. It was really to talk about the value of cinema and to thank all of those around the world that were supporting and the Academy. That's what he would have shared. And that they traded that for, I guess, the karma of what happened with Will Smith. You know, you look at Will Smith, whose performance was great.
As King Richard.
Just, I mean, why?
Amazing, yeah.
This petty kind of thing happens. I was back, and a part of the trip that was more related to my organization, CORE, back in Ukraine, at this point in Lviv when that happened. And literally, I felt.
Were you watching it?
No, I wasn't watching it, but I heard about it in the morning after and saw the clip. And I literally felt something like safer in Ukraine than Hollywood watching it, mentally. How it just seemed so small.
And when you, in your earlier incarnation, punched somebody, you got a 60-day jail sentence, served half of it in prison.
Yeah.
Will Smith goes back up to receive the Best Actor award after whacking somebody at the Oscars live and gets an ovation from the audience. Yeah,
that ovation should be, that should be played on this show a lot of times too, because shame on them. So yeah, I just felt that was a very low moment in whatever, the leadership of the Academy in denying this thing, having, or the producer of that particular show being of such lack of substance. It was discouraging, yeah.
What did you think was going through Will Smith's head? It was so shocking.
I don't know. We've all heard different stories and speculations. I don't know. I just think it was it could have been averted had the first decision been a brave and noble one before it got to him.
You were so angry about this. You wanted to melt down your 2 Oscars for bullets for Ukrainian soldiers to use against the Russians. And in the end, you didn't do it, but you gave one of your Oscars to President Zelensky, but on loan. And you said, when this war's over, bring it back to Malibu. And we've got a clip of what you'd like to do when you see him after this war ends. It's a lovely thought, but you must have had quite a few moments, not least when you left Kyiv that first time on the day war had broken out, and you were able to leave and he was left there, that you might never see him again.
Of course. Yeah, it creeped up on me by surprise because, when you meet somebody who's in circumstances that reasonably could end in any way you can imagine, and where there were such clear intentions by, it's understood that there were Chechen kill squads in the streets of Kyiv who were targeting he and his family at that time. So it was coming at it from all angles, the potential targeting of government buildings, snipers, everything. And that he was this target, you make a decision faster, emotionally, and I recognize my affection for him. So I felt, I can't speak for him in this, he had a lot of things to respond to, but I felt a friendship, at least from my side, like a bond. And when we left, it suddenly hit me. What did I do that for? What did I open myself up to that for? And it was a real worry in that present sense. I think most people feel, and I'd like to focus on this now, that because of his courage, because of the way he coalesced that kind of courage in the nation and the amazing defense that they put up for their freedom and continue to, including now some offense, to rightly so, to get their freedom. There was enough reasonable thought that he would now be a martyr that you wouldn't want to target on that level. So I've let myself get a little relaxed, just superficially in that sense. But yeah, there were a couple of months. That first 2 months, it was a bother.
Has he seen the movie?
Yeah.
What did he think of it?
Well, first of all, he saw an earlier cut, but what was, we showed this movie even publicly. As soon as we felt there were times it would be of value to something, like we had shown it in Germany at one time, long before it was finished, and I would argue not in a good way, but because it, more importantly than it being a good movie or me being proud of it filmically, there were times where we felt we had something that would help the discussion go further, and that was our first aim. So, because I only really finished the movie a couple of months ago, and then he, as in the movie as it stands today, you saw it. The first half hour is not easy on him.
Not very complimentary. No.
And as a filmmaker, he had the patience to watch the whole thing. And so we walked into the office. This is some time after, I don't know, we'd made several trips. I'd seen him several times before this. And this was the trip we were making to show him the rough cut for the first time. And so he saw it sometime between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning before starting his day. And we saw him at about 4 in the afternoon. When we came into the office, he's standing there looking at me and he said, "I bet you're glad I watched the whole thing."
I bet you were too.
Yeah, I was.
Because he does go on a journey. I mean, and you're quite right, to tell the story of the preface to this war, because it wasn't all as it is now for Zelensky. He wasn't this great. He wasn't a national hero, never mind international. There's another moment in the movie, which rather selfishly I like, which is where I pop up. But it's quite interesting because it's a clip from when I was doing my show at CNN, and I ask you a question, but you don't actually show the answer in the film. Let's have a look. What really? I had to wait 10 years for the answer, but there it was. It's an interesting one because, as always with everything you do, it's divided opinion. You said about this reaction you always get, "I dream of a world where chickens can cross the road without having their motives questioned," which I loved. But you also said, after you won the second Oscar for Milk, you said, "I want it to be very clear that I do know how hard I make it to appreciate me." And it seems from this interview, Sean, that you've certainly, and maybe it's age, wisdom, experience, I don't know, stuff going on in your life. It seems that you've grown more self-aware, perhaps. Is that a fair observation?
I think that there is some vanity fatigue. You get to the point where I have vanity, I don't have room for it in my pack.
Because you've been accused, obviously, there's too much of you in the movie and so on, but you make a joke of that several times, about you're not trying to be Walter Cronkite and they liken you to Raul de Rivera and so on. You're seeing that joke, but at the same time, you're also aware you wouldn't have got the movie off first base if you weren't front and center with this. It wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and again, it had to do with recognizing, and this was a process. First we couldn't get the financing if I wasn't on camera. It's very hard, these movies. Now, there's a great movie called Freedom on Fire, which is a companion piece to Winter on Fire by Evgeny Evanivsky, who was nominated for the Academy Award for Winter on Fire, about the Maidan Revolution. And he hasn't been able to get a distributor for this thing, because these kinds of films are very difficult right now. I think he just showed it at the Vatican to the Pope, and hopefully some traction will come off of that. But so for us to get this thing done required me being in it. Then, I felt like again, it was saying, what's the value added? And of course, I can be mocked in whatever way, but I do think we were really successful, despite in the truth of how people can benefit from this thing, by offering myself to it in a way that is kind of like, it's kind of one of the, so like I say here, I've gotten access to people and things that I know wouldn't have come without my day job supporting that, and financially as well as in terms of access to people. And that normally, though it might not seem it to people because it gets covered, I have tried to avoid covering those trips and what I'm actually doing. And I thought, this time I'm going to let people come with me. Mm. And in the editing, it was really important to me. I make it clear, I have opinions. big surprise. But I also have played that film in editing to myself without any of my opinions expressed, to see if it still operates. And that's what was important to me. So anyone who's predisposed to doubting me or not liking me or whatever it is, just doesn't like my sourpuss face or something, they can ignore all of that and still get what the key of this film is. And I do think that it can be a mechanism by which people can come together a little more and refocus what we had all promised the Ukrainians in the first place when we all started putting our Ukrainian flags out,
Right.
and promised young people that we would follow through. And if this is one more time we tell young people we won't follow through as a government, as their parents, as their schools, on this fundamental thing, and we're still aware that these people like us, by that I mean freedom-loving people who were attacked and raped and kidnapped and murdered and separated from their families, you know, that's a good way to create a generation of Americans, not much less, you know, those in the battlefield who just are disenfranchised mentally.
You've been dipping your toe back into acting again. And you did say 5 years ago, I'm not in love with that anymore, about acting. Are you falling a bit back in love with it again?
Well, I had an experience that surprised me. Yeah, I did a movie called Daddy-O with Dakota Johnson, directed and written by a woman named Christy Hall. And it was kind of a gift of a piece, just really wonderfully written thing. And I hate admitting this part of it, but it was all run by women. Better than other jobs I'd been on.
Really?
And
You sound surprised, Sean.
no, just, you know, embittered of my original intent to be, you know, a misogynist my whole life.
Well, you've been quite interesting about that, because you said about that, I'm in the club that believes that men in American culture have become wildly feminized. I don't think that being a brute or having insensitivity or disrespect for women is anything to do with masculinity or ever did. But I don't think that in order to be fair to women, we should become them.
That's true too. Yeah. Yeah, no, look, sometimes they say the toughest guy on the block is the one with the least to lose. Women have less to lose these days. And so they're by toughest, I think also it's going to see a generation where there's per capita more competence.
What do you think of the current world we live in, where people no longer want to say what a woman is for fear of being cancelled?
I'm bored with it. I think let's talk about that when people aren't being vaporized on the front lines of wars. And you know, I'll stay out of judgment on it, but I'm not engaged in the conversation. It just seems not like the priority.
There's a couple of other Hollywood things that have happened since I knew I was going to talk to you. One, the Hollywood strikes got resolved, but that whole issue of AI, you said something very powerful about this. You said, okay, you said it's immoral for you, AI being able to use your likeness, your voice to do stuff without you. Said, okay, so you likened it to this. You want my scans and voice data and all that. Okay, here's what I think is fair. I want your daughters. I want to create a virtual replica of her and invite my friends over to do whatever we want in a virtual party right now. Would you please look at the camera and tell me you think that's cool?
Yeah.
That was powerful. I mean, you're taking on head on what many perceive to be the immorality of what may be happening with AI and Hollywood.
Yeah, I think the AMPTP were representative of an immoral and an indecent proposal. And that, you know, if you or I or wants to sell or use or share that data, power to anybody who wants to selectively do that. But even to ask to own another's is, you know, we complain about sexual harassment in the workplace, or
it's robot harassment.
Yeah, well, you know, and let me see your medical records, and let me see, you know, it's just.
Do you think there's a robot alive though, Sean, that could possibly come close to replicating Sean Penn? in all your glory.
Yes, because it's not only functional robots that we're seeing made.
The other thing I wanted to ask you about was the very sad death of Matthew Perry, because you appeared in several episodes of Friends, and he suffered from a lot of addiction issues. He wrote an incredible book about it, one of the most powerful books I've read. But your son Hooper had addiction issues, and you talked about that. He said you saved his life. Your thoughts about Matthew?
What a talented guy. I can't claim to have known him well, but I liked him very much. I saw him somewhat recently, and we were both catching a flight out of Los Angeles airport, and I complimented him on what I knew of his book. I hadn't read the book. I had seen several of his interviews, and he seemed to be talking about, had confronted it, and was very intelligent and bold about it, and generously offering his experience to people to be helpful. But look, it's tragic. I can't say that I was terribly surprised. I don't know what the whole coroner's report things and everything, but I know he had done a lot of damage to his organs over the years. And, tough situation. And, he got to do that. He got to leave that tail behind, and he got to give a lot of joy to a lot of people with his talent. And so, I wish his family well.
I want to end with another quote from William Saroyan. This is also from the stuff you used to keep in your wallet. Do you still keep it in your wallet, or do you not anymore?
I do, but I run out of them very quickly because I
you give them to people.
Yeah,
I know you do, yeah.
Like a challenge coin.
He said, in the time of your life, live so that in the good time there should be no ugliness or death for yourself or for any life your life touches. Seek goodness everywhere, and when it's found, bring it out of its hiding place. Let it be free and unashamed. Discover in all things that which shines and is beyond corruption. Encourage virtue in whatever heart it may have been driven into secrecy and sorrow by the shame and terror of the world. In the time of your life, live, so that in that wondrous time you shall not add to the misery and sorrow of the world, but shall smile to the infinite delight and mystery of it.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Is that your mantra for life?
Increasingly, yeah. It's one of the things we owe people who are suffering is to count our blessings and enjoy while counting them in our thoughts and our actions. But to really enjoy, because this is a magic world.
I've tried to maintain the highest standards of journalism for this interview, because you said recently, I still don't like journalism that focuses on what toilet paper celebrities use. Out of interest, what toilet paper do you use?
I've got a roll of Putin face paper.
Have you really?
Yeah, somebody gave it to me, yeah.
You see, sometimes it's those questions that get the best answers. And the other thing I couldn't help but notice, because you turned up with her here, is you have a new lady in your life, Olga, and she's Ukrainian. How did you guys meet?
My good luck.
She's here.
She is.
Shall I get her in to ask? No. But you're happy?
Yeah, very happy.
Sean, it's good to see you again.
Great to see you.
Let's not leave us alone next time.
All right, good.
And I love the movie.
Thanks.
I genuinely think it's an important, timely, and powerful film. And I hope a lot of people go and watch it, because it tells you the real story of Ukraine, but also accurately represents Zelensky, who has been demonized by a lot of people now for political expediency, but actually, I think, is the nearest thing to Churchill we've seen since Churchill. And was as unpopular as Churchill before Churchill did what he did.
Right.
But good luck with it. It's an important film.
Thanks a lot.
Good to see you.